But with that in mind, I'd like to now turn it over to the next step, which is the panel discussion. We'll invite members of the advisory committee who have been involved in this project for the last 3 or plus years to share some of their thoughts on this whole topic, the trial, but the bigger message of how do we actually include virtual twins in the regulatory process to make it faster. So with that, I'd like to invite up to the stage Ashley Peterson, Steve Cruiser, and Jitesh Vital. And joining us remotely, who we have, is Brent Craven from the FDA. We have Brent? We do? Great. Thanks, Brent, for making it.
Thank you.
Okay, great, that's all working. Okay, so for the next half hour or so, I'm going to fire off questions, really tough ones in some cases, and we're going to get candid answers from the team here. So what I'd like to do is just allow each, rather than have me do the introductions, before you speak for the first time, please introduce yourself so the audience knows who you are and kind of where you come from. Okay, so let's get started. And not surprising, Brent, we're going to start with you.
I'm Brent Craven. I'm a research scientist at FDA. I'm kind of leading our modeling and simulation initiatives here for regulatory science. I've been at FDA for about 9 years. My background is in modeling cardiovascular devices. So yeah, I've been working with Dassault and Steve for several years on the enrichment project that you heard, and looking forward to chatting today.
Great. Thanks. And again, I think if you haven't been working with Brent or the team there, it's eye-opening to see how much effort and knowledge they actually have about what we're doing at the FDA. Hopefully you'll get a glimpse of that. So with that in mind, maybe Brent, could you just open the stage with a little bit about how you, as one of the leaders, would characterize today's use of modeling and simulation in the regulatory process? Do you see it? Is it visible? What do you think?
Yeah, we get a lot of submissions with modeling and simulation. You can look to see some of the numbers. My colleague Tina Morrison had done a survey several years ago, looking to see how many modeling simulation submissions we get. At that time, it was on the order of about 200 or so, and that was about 5 years ago. I think we see more. I would say that we see more than that today. I can't talk directly about what we see in submissions. I can kind of talk generally about what we see kind of the community moving towards. I think historically, a lot of us have seen modeling being used to guide non-clinical testing. For example, identifying worst case conditions or worst case sizes for family of devices to try to reduce testing rather than testing all devices, test the worst case. I think in the past several years, we're seeing, companies in the community wanting to move beyond worst case identification, really trying to use modeling to make, what I probably call high risk decisions, try to eliminate or significantly reduce testing with modeling, and to the extent of even trying to reduce patients in clinical trials through in silico clinical trials. So I think really moving towards away from worst case identification towards trying to really use modeling more and more.
Well, fantastic. I know that that's welcome news to everyone in the audience. So Jitesh,
okay.
You kind of represent the interface between the regulatory bodies and the industries. Maybe you could share what you see from your overarching view.
Okay. So to start off, I am a senior program director for Medical Device Innovation Consortium, MDIC. It's kind of a unique concept of its kind. So I just wanted to add 1 or 2 sentences about MDIC. We are a consortium. That means we have members from industry, predominantly device and diagnostics manufacturers, and then federal entities like FDA, MHRA, National Institute of Health, NIH, CMS, and so on. So we have all these entities as our members in our consortium. We might sound like a little bit of a trade association, but we don't work on policy or advocacy, but we work on purely on regulatory science, and that's why I think this panel discussion is very important here. So just to give a sense of what we do, we work as an interface between, as Steve mentioned, between the experts from regulatory bodies and the counterparts from industry, and come together in a very pre-competitive open space and discuss how are this amazing technology, for example, you heard all the beautiful modeling and simulation experiments and innovation, how can we bring into market within the existing constraints of regulation? There might be out-of-the-box ways without even advocating for policy. Of course, we can hope for policy change that is long-term. What can we do right now? So that's what MDIC is focusing on, and we are very fortunate to have support of FDA leadership. Actually, Jeff Shuren, CDRH director, was instrumental in creation of MDIC almost 10 years ago. And right from that inception of MDIC, computational modeling and simulation was a prime programmatic area at MDIC, and we are fortunate to have support of people like Steve Levine in bringing modeling simulation to the forefront. Now, in particular to this particular question, how do we characterize modeling and simulation in a regulatory context? We have been assessing the field, through surveys and individual conversation with the industry and other stakeholders. It's a mixed bag, actually. When we did a recent survey, what we found was over 90% of our industry members said FDA supports modeling and simulation. FDA accepts the data for modeling and simulation in their process. But on the other side, we also heard from industry that only 50% of them actually submit data to FDA. And then we very specifically asked, do you really know, or internally do you know, what kind of data you need to submit? 1/3 of them said, no, we don't know. So there is still that lag or understanding, lack of understanding in the industry. And that's what we are trying to connect here. I mean, the trend is actually positive. We are seeing more and more submission, but there is still that awareness gap. So hopefully, these kind of forums will help us to advance the field.
Great. Thanks, Jitesh. Actually, so maybe Ashley, you can speak to the question that Jitesh just brought up, the idea that the FDA is encouraging this use, but the industry has the data, but somehow it doesn't all get to the FDA. And we talked about the documents that they've presented, the guidance and the rules. You represent, you serve, you help the industry to be able to develop this data and to use it. Can you talk a little bit about how the guidance documents maybe do help and could be used to further and accelerate?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So before I get started, my name's Ashley Peterson. I've been at Thornton Tom City for about 4 years now. Prior to that, I was at Medtronic for about 10 years. All of that has been in computational modeling and experimental testing associated with computational modeling. But that's a good question of how do you use those guidance documents. There's some fantastic documents out there, and for me, they are kind of a roadmap, maybe a template, but definitely not a check-the-box kind of set of instructions. For me, they're most useful, and for our clients, they're most useful as a dialogue, as a vocabulary, if you will. They are a way that you can communicate with the regulatory bodies in a way that both of you understand. So you understand what the expectations are, you understand what you're trying to communicate, you understand how you can communicate that information. So by embracing those documents and kind of rolling those into your submission packages, you can create a much higher level dialogue with the regulatory bodies.
Great. Okay, but I can't help but, Brent, also ask you to give your comments on, since you participate in creating, reviewing these documents, what's your view on how the industry is using them? Are they meeting your expectations?
It depends. Well, I guess be clear about what documents. So I think there are kind of 3 documents. We have the 2016 FDA reporting guidance that kind of lays out what information to include in modeling simulation submission. We have the very seminal 2018 ASME V&V40 standard, which is FDA recognized. Basically, companies come in, they use it, they can conform to it, and we rely on data using that standard. But that standard is, very general. It lays out a framework for credibility assessment of modeling. And then the final piece of guidance is we have a draft guidance for modeling simulation credibility assessment that it's not final guidance yet. It's not currently in effect. Hopefully it will be in the near future. But basically that guidance builds on ASME V&V40 and extends it to clinical applications, including patient-specific modeling and silico clinical trials. So those are kind of the 3 documents, I think, for the most part, that apply to modeling and simulation. But I think, as Ash said, they provide kind of a roadmap or a means, a framework to have dialogue about what information to include, how do you do a risk assessment to figure out how much validation should be included. I think what we really need as a community is to have examples of how to use those guidance documents. And a good example for in silico clinical trials is the enrichment project. And there's a couple other examples that the community is working on, but I think that'll help provide really good examples for industry to follow, kind of a boilerplate. If you want to do fatigue assessment for a device, here's an example of how V&V40 and the guidance documents have been applied.
Great, yeah. Certainly, one of the things we all know is, particularly as scientists and engineers, we love to follow examples. Don't give me a document, just give me an example, something I can just work through. And so I think the call out to the industry and the community to help create those is a really good point. And so to that point, building that communication, bridging that gap in understanding. Steve, maybe you can follow this question. You've been part of the in silico clinical trial project, and a lot of what we talk about is when to do that study and when to confer with the regulatory bodies. Do you wait to the end, say, hey, this is what I did, or should you get started at the beginning? What's your thoughts on when you should actually engage with the regulators?
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. So Steve Cruiser, do a lot of computational modeling simulation, as we all do. A lot of testing to support that. So we've been involved in many device analyses, and particularly in regards to the enrichment conversation, Steve, as you mentioned. And I'm going to play off of what Ash said with respect to the roadmap and the dialogue, as well as what Brent said with respect to the examples. I think the conversation starting early is beneficial. We all know that regulatory agencies would prefer to have Q-sub type conversations as early as possible to get everybody on the same page. As it relates to in silico clinical trials, I think there's really 2 big reasons for starting that dialogue as early as possible. One is you're going to have these examples. Hopefully more examples will come out in the future. But it's going to be important for everybody to understand and to have the conversation about how those examples map to whatever your situation is. So different devices come along. There's going to be specifics for that device, peculiarities with respect to that device, other aspects that need to be understood in terms of how do you interpolate in some sense between those examples. But more importantly, I think it's really important to have that conversation early, because much of the evidence that you want to rely on for your in silico clinical trial is evidence you have to gather through some level of clinical trial. So there needs to be some early stage trial. Maybe it's an animal study, maybe it's some other application of trial data that you're gathering in a different context. But you need to get that information in order to understand how you're going to then use it for credibility purposes to be able to map into your final example of your in silico clinical trial that you're trying to run.
So maybe just add on to that. So a lot of what we hear, we've heard some good words. In fact, Bernard Charles started off with this yesterday, which I thought was really setting the stage, is that as we journey towards the virtual twin of the human, We're not necessarily trying to replicate the entire human body. Perfection is not our goal, it's utility. So as we put in the regulatory context, modeling the human, do you think it's really possible to model the patient? How do you take on that entirety? Is it possible?
Well, with enough computers, sure. Enough Zhang's, I'm going to call out Zhang because she can do whatever she needs. But no, I think it is possible to model the context of what you're looking at. And we have in the community the concept of context of use, question of interest, essentially the scope of whatever you're trying to do with your analysis. It's really important to clearly articulate that, and there's some discussion, obviously, that can be had in regards to how to do that and thoughts around that process. But really setting that scope, and if you just define that scope in a certain way, that's going to allow you to perform the modeling that you need to perform. We want to get as much information as is necessary into the model, but for various reasons, time, expense, and others, you don't want to go beyond that. So modeling a full patient might be valuable if the question you're trying to address requires that situation. If you're looking at something like in the enrichment process, a MitraClip, maybe an apparatus scale model is what you need to address that question. But at the end of the day, the question, is it possible? I'm an optimist. I'm going to say yes, it definitely is. You just got to get the right tools in place. That includes clinical information. That includes the right people to run the analyses. That includes the right technology to the software, et cetera, to actually run those analyses.
Great. Okay. Once again, Brent, I got to ask you the same question. Do we stand a chance? Can we do this to meet the requirements of the guidance documents, the expectations of the FDA?
Yeah, definitely. Although maybe I can comment on your last question about when to come in to FDA with modeling, because that's really important from our perspective. We really encourage companies to come in with pre-submissions through a pre-submission pathway early on, and there's a number of reasons why, especially for modeling. If you want to use modeling for a really novel use, if you want to replace a bench test or something like that, from our side, there's a historical precedent on how many on devices and how a lot of devices are evaluated. There's standard test methods that are used. So if you want to deviate from that, it's really beneficial to come in early so we can all get on the same page. So we really encourage companies to come in as early as possible. To answer your second question, I think it's definitely possible to model patients. I think there's a lot of good examples or success stories. I think one of those is, we know there are software as a medical device products on the market that use modeling to predict patient-specific fractional flow reserve for diagnosing and managing coronary artery diseases. And they've dealt with this issue, how to manage patients or how to model patients. I think there's a lot of other opportunities, but I think we also need to be aware of the challenges. Oftentimes if we're modeling patients, we might not have all the information we need. So material properties, boundary conditions. So what do we do under those conditions? Do we do uncertainty quantification? So I think there are some unique challenges. Also, I think one of the major challenges that we have to figure out when we model patients, especially clinically, is that our models often predict physics-based quantities, stress and strain and pressure and velocity, which are not clinical metrics. They're not clinical indices often. They're not mortality or hospitalization, which is we're often concerned about clinically. So, translating our models, our simulation outputs to clinical outputs, I think is a major challenge and something, that we have to deal with each use of modeling simulation for patient-specific application.
Yeah, great. Yeah, definitely a challenge. Something we'll be talking quite a bit more about, making that translation. So we hear a lot about there's advancements, and you mentioned one company solved the problem here, one company solved the problem there, but how does the industry get to learn from that? So maybe Jitesh, the MDIC is that interface trying to help take the best learnings, abstract it so that everybody can benefit. Can you maybe talk about what MDIC is doing to foster that communication and education?
Yeah, so MDIC is a kind of uniquely positioned because we don't have any conflict of interest, right? So FDA is on board and industry stakeholders are on board. And I think the point we are making here is we need examples, we need best practices, we need some frameworks and models so that these innovations can be broadly adopted. Now, MDIC also worked a couple of years ago, maybe the precursor of the in silico enrichment project, which Steve highlighted. So there is this unique opportunity. Actually, this is kind of cultural aspect too for the industry. We can even engage with FDA even beyond the pre-sub and Q-sub. That's what MDIC is actually doing. And FDA and industry together worked out this idea of a virtual patient during the inception of MDIC or the early stages of MDIC itself. And instead of a Q-sub at that time, industry collectively worked together and came up with a mock submission on an ICD-led device, again in the cardiovascular space. So there are opportunities to work collaboratively in a pre-competitive space and come up with good examples, frameworks. Actually, some of the documents which MDIC produced with help of FDA and industry exactly does that. We collect good examples. Sometimes that's not publicly available, or even if it's available, it's difficult to access or digest and promote it. So that's what we hope to do. That's what we encourage the community to do.
Great. Okay, so I know there are a million questions. I'm going to have to cut it short a little bit, but you're all available, except for maybe Brent, but you can find him. But they're all available for follow-up questions. I just want to maybe kind of get the panel's view. For the enrichment project, we put ourselves in the place of a medical device company and kind of work through that process of creating a device and working through the entire process. And there were more than 50 people involved in that process, and you all spent quite a lot of time. So maybe living in those shoes for a moment, maybe I'll just ask the panel to share some of their thoughts on observations, what they found most interesting, impactful, surprising. Maybe I'll start with you, Ash. What struck you as unique or interesting?
Don't quite know where to start with that one, but yeah. I'll give it a go. Some of the things which I found challenging was we had a wide variety of folks who are involved in the project, and quite often we would have discussions and then rediscussions and then more discussions about for example, the context of use or the question of interest. And we reformulated. And I think the one thing that was quite surprising was that we were all very much aligned with the total project goal, but within each group's kind of project constraints, we all had to work together to find some common language which was acceptable to everyone. So I think that was perhaps the most surprising, is that even when everyone's pulling in the same direction, there still needs to be a lot of dialogue between the team members to get everyone to agree on everything. Yeah, sometimes it's not the technical challenges, it's the human communication. Yeah, that's for sure. I think that the technical abilities and software are there. It's really getting people together.
Okay. Steve, you want to take a...
Sure, love to. Yeah, we'll definitely echo the communication aspect of things. I think in retrospect, it seems kind of obvious, but in going through the process, one of the things that struck me as perhaps a major learning coming out of it is the importance, and one of your questions earlier, Steve touched on it, but the importance of generating the type of clinical information that's going to be necessary to support your model. We're used to doing that in many contexts where modeling and simulation are used currently in the regulatory space, things that Brent mentioned in regards to replacing benchtop tests, et cetera. But when you really start to get at the question of what does a clinician care about this? How is a clinician going to view this? How is the efficacy going to be assessed of this device? That becomes a much harder question, and it becomes a question where you really do want as much of that clinical data as possible, and it really behooves you to gather that information as soon as possible. So it's almost like a projection exercise where you need to start very early to understand what is your model going to predict. Then you have to ask the question, what do I need to get in order to build credibility in that model? And then you need to go and do the clinical exercise. Then you need to come back to the model. There's just this continual iteration. And I really liked your total product lifecycle diagram because you took out the big wheel and you put in these little wheels up at the top. And I really think that's to me at least, one of the major outcomes is just understanding the value of those flywheels, if you will, earlier in the process and getting people on board and having that communication as soon as possible.
Great, thanks.
So my point is beyond the enrichment project itself. So the beauty of enrichment project is it's end-to-end. It has been envisioned in a really end-to-end fashion. We know this modeling and simulation is hard. The acceptance is still a challenge. But the way FDA and Dassault system work together, this end-to-end. So that gives a very powerful story once the playbook is officially released. That's going to increase the adoption rate of modeling simulation broadly. That's what struck me. I want to make this analogy here. This week, Apple, introduced, the augmented reality. Nothing new there, but as a full package and the story they are telling. And I think the enrichment project is somewhat to that. Brought all the components together from end to end, and giving this powerful explanation there. So, kudos.
Well, that's a great analogy. I may need to use it. So Brent, you were on the front lines with this. You were in the trenches. Maybe I'll give you the last word on what some takeaways from that experience for you.
Yeah, I think one of the major takeaways, there are a couple of them. I definitely agree with Steve that I think when we started this project, we didn't fully appreciate whenever you want to replace patients or try to predict clinical outcomes, thinking about what the clinician cares about, and if you're going to replace a patient or try to augment a trial or enrich a trial, having this similar outputs as what you would have in the real trial is really important because that's what the end decision is made on in real patients. So how can you come up with the same thing from your simulation outputs? So, coming up with this idea of, there's basically a link between your simulations outputs and the clinical outputs and that you need to develop and validate. I think that concept of breaking down in silico clinical trial into the different pieces and then looking at the credibility of each of those pieces, I think was kind of a major outcome of the project. And then documenting that in the playbook. And I think, the playbook kind of establishes some best practices for in silico clinical trials around that thinking. So I think that was one of the major outcomes in my mind.
Right. Fantastic. Okay, well, appreciate everyone's participation. The panelists, we're out of time. Certainly a topic we will not stop talking about for a long time. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists for their great contribution. Thank you, guys.